Let's just jump right into this explainer, where we are unpacking a really fascinating forensic dissection of a heavily debated historical claim from June 1984. We're looking at a meticulous piece of analysis written by Kanwar Partap Singh Gill titled The Van Without a Log. Now, rather than just reciting history, this source material does something highly unusual and, honestly, incredibly compelling. It takes a well-known historical narrative and treats it exactly like a witness on the stand, applying a rigorous, real-time legal cross-examination to claims made by former officials. It's an exercise in holding history to the strict standard of documentary evidence, and the way the author structures it is absolutely gripping.
To kick things off, we really have to ask a profound question about our source material. How does a historical narrative actually hold up when the foundational paperwork just vanishes? You know, when we learn about history, we often take for granted that the events described in memoirs or official statements are backed up by a solid paper trail. Orders, logs, registers, all of that. But what happens when you look for that paper trail decades later and you find absolutely nothing? Can we legally say an event happened if the state itself literally cannot produce a single piece of administrative documentation to prove it? Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this case study.
So let's start by digging into the official warning claim. We need to establish the baseline official narrative. Back in June 1984, during Operation Blue Star, the civil administration of Amritsar district, led at the time by Deputy Commissioner Ramesh Inder Singh, was theoretically responsible for the civil and judicial authority of the area. The official story has long relied heavily on the existence of a specific state vehicle, a public relations van. According to this narrative, before military action fully escalated, this van was deployed outside the Darbar Sahib complex to broadcast an evacuation warning via loudspeaker, basically telling civilians to come out with their hands raised so they wouldn't be fired upon. This single vehicle carries an enormous legal function, right? It acts as the state's primary proof that civilians were given a meaningful opportunity to leave. But the author starkly contrasts the claims made in those memoirs against the cold, hard reality of the 2017 court findings. For decades, this van has survived in books, in interviews, in public recollections, but during the 2017 Jodhpur detainee proceedings, when the state was asked to actually produce the underlying administrative records for this van, it simply couldn't. No vehicle log, no written civil record. The memoir makes the claim, sure, but the courtroom record, it just doesn't verify it.
This leads the author into examining what they call a structurally defective warning.
The source article doesn't just stop at asking if the van existed physically. It acts like a prosecutor, putting the warning through a really rigorous legal stress test. The author argues that, hey, even if we assume a van drove up and made a sound, that does not automatically equate to a lawful, effective warning. To prove a warning was actually given, the state has to prove the mechanics of that warning actually worked. To do that, the author constructs a systematic breakdown of what an official evacuation requires in the eyes of the law, laying out a 5-part test. It must possess authority, meaning someone officially ordered it, timing, meaning it happened before avenues of escape were closed, audibility, so the targets can actually hear the message, a safe exit protocol for those who comply, and finally a record, the administrative proof that these steps were taken. Let's walk through this cross-examination step by step.
Starting with authority, the article zeroes in on the jurisdictional fact that neither a civil dispatch order nor an army requisition was ever produced for this vehicle. Think about how any government operates for a second. When a district administration deploys a vehicle, there is always a motor transport register. It logs the registration number, the date, the route, the authorizing officer. A state doesn't just borrow a vehicle, it leaves a heavy paper trail. But here, nothing. If the Army requisitioned the van, where's the requisition? If the civil administration dispatched it, where's the order? Without these documents, the foundational authority for the announcement simply cannot be established in the historical record.
Then, there's the whole issue of timing. The author argues the warning arrived into a cage that was essentially already sealed. The timeline of the military encirclement in June 1984 is well documented. The article points out that if the complex was already surrounded and civilians were physically sealed inside by a strict curfew and military presence, well then making an announcement doesn't actually provide a chance to leave. You can't claim you offered an exit when the physical doors to that exit have already been locked.
For audibility, the author brings in the account of military witness Brigadier Onkar Garaya to highlight a massive structural defect. The people meant to hear the message simply couldn't in real time. Garaya is often cited to prove the van was there, but the author flips this completely on its head. Garaya noted the van was approximately 80 yards from the main entrance. Think about that. If the van is 80 yards away, over the massive din of a military operation, how could anyone deep inside the complex actually hear the instructions?
The author argues that, even by the state's own witness accounts, the warning was structurally defective right out of the gate because it wasn't audible to its intended audience.
Now let's look at the safe exit requirement, and this is where it really builds. The author lists the glaring absence of any documented protocol for receiving civilians who might have tried to leave. Say someone did hear the van, what were they supposed to do? The article asks some tough questions. Were specific exit gates identified? No. Were perimeter troops given written non-fire orders so they wouldn't shoot at emerging civilians? No. Were there receiving registers to record the names of those who safely evacuated? No. What about SGPC intermediaries guiding those civilians out? Absolutely none. The author concludes that what the van offered wasn't an evacuation, it was merely exposure.
And this brings us into a much broader, darker pattern: the paperless death regime.
This is the absolute crux of the cross-examination, the official record, or rather, the complete lack thereof. This is where the explainer transitions from dissecting a single event in 1984 to uncovering a much broader administrative pattern that haunted the region for the next decade. During the 2017 Jodhpur detainee proceedings, an incredible 33 years after the operation, the court found absolutely no documentary evidence of this van. That's a judicial determination, not just an allegation. The state had 33 years and every opportunity to pull the vehicle logs from its archives to definitively prove its claims. But the court formally concluded there was no written record of a public announcement and no log of the vehicle allegedly used.
It becomes chillingly clear that this missing log isn't just a simple administrative slip-up or a byproduct of chaos. Instead, the author argues it was the blueprint for a much larger, systemic issue of impunity. When a state acts without generating standard administrative paperwork, it effectively shields itself from future accountability. That absence of paperwork, the author suggests, becomes a defining characteristic, an intentional administrative feature rather than a bug.
The author then dramatically scales out the impact, connecting the logic of the missing 1984 van log to the staggering number of 2,097 illegal cremations later found by the Central Bureau of Investigation in Amritsar district during the 1990s. The author draws a direct, unbroken line between the administrative practices established in June 1984 and the grim reality that followed under successive district magistrates. The tolerance for a lack of documentation didn't just start and stop with a single loudspeaker van.
And this illustrates the article's core thesis perfectly. The precedent of an undocumented civil defense in 1984 set the stage for a decade of undocumented cremations. The exact same pattern of missing paperwork repeats itself. In the 1990s, the state operated with no inquest reports, no custody transfer records, no identification registers, no death certificates with names, no cremation registers with family notifications. As the author powerfully states, the appearance of procedure could survive without procedure itself. The van without a log was simply the first iteration of the body without a certificate.
Which leads to the final, closing demand.
The article culminates in a final prosecutorial challenge directed right at the historical record itself. The author steps back into the role of the cross-examiner, putting the burden of proof squarely back on those who continue to rely on memoirs rather than files. The author lists 14 specific, standard administrative documents that the state has completely failed to produce over the last 42 years. The demand is simple. Produce the file, not the interview, not the hazy recollection. Produce the order authorizing the announcement. Produce the exact text of the announcement. Produce the vehicle log and route. Produce the driver's name, the officer in charge, the timing sheet, the safe exit plan, the receiving register, the after-action report. In any standard government operation, these files are mandatory. Yet, as the 2017 court found, none of them seem to exist.
The article concludes its forensic breakdown with this incredibly powerful legal summation, effectively reducing the van to its precise, undocumented status. By stripping away the narrative and focusing entirely on the evidentiary framework, the author leaves us with a stark reality. Legally speaking, the van did not exist as a lawful warning. It existed merely as an undocumented phantom, the first ghost of a system that learned to operate without ever leaving a paper trail.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we leave you to consider how historical narratives are truly constructed, and what actually happens when the underlying paperwork simply isn't there. When we read a memoir or hear an official account, we have to ask, where is the log? Where is the register? Because as this forensic analysis brilliantly shows, when the documents are missing, history isn't just incomplete, it risks becoming an instrument of impunity. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I hope it encourages you to always look for the file.